people often say to me, kids don't need moms and dads, they just need to be safe and loved. And I say, well, congratulations, you're one of us. Because the household where children are most likely to be safe and loved is, according to the agreement of experts on the left and the right, the home of their married biological mother and father. So advocating for children's rights in the family not only grants them with the safest, most loving households, it also gives them something that children crave, which is their biological identity. Only the two adults who are responsible for their existence show them who they are on a core genetic, biological level. And for us adults that grew up with moms and dads that we knew, we're like, what does that matter? Well, ask the children created through sperm and egg donation whether or not it matters, right? Most of them have identity struggles. I'd say around 50%, right? And we can talk about adoption, right? Because I'm an adoptive mom, I'm an adoption advocate. I used to work at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. I believe that adoption is a just society's response to children in need, right? I believe especially that Christians have a mandate to love and protect and serve those who have lost their first families. But adoption begins with loss for kids. And the adopted kids that I've worked with are very curious about who their biological parents are. And the adoption community has recognized this because now, about 50 years ago, almost all adoptions were closed adoptions. There was no connection with the child's family of origin. Today, 95% of adoptions are open adoptions because social workers recognize that children benefit from as many connections with their first family as possible, even if they can't or shouldn't be raised by them. So that's sort of the foundation of children's rights, right? We look at everything from the perspective of the child. The world looks at all these different marriage and family issues from the perspective of adults, what they want, how they identify, pursuing their own sexual freedom. We look at every marriage and family issue through the lens of the child. What do children have a right to? What do children need? What are they owed from adults in their life? So today we're going to talk about surrogacy because there's a lot of confusion about it, especially among conservatives, pro-lifers, even Christians. Good morning. Come on in. We'll take as much of you as we can get. There's no shame. Great to have you. Have a handout. So we're going to talk about three primary child rights today. And we're going to look at why surrogacy violates all three of them, right? And again, I know that as policymakers, you are confronted by incredible economic benefits to having these industries operate in your state. And I know that you're confronted by emotional appeals from adults. And those are hard to counter. I totally understand. You need to look at this from the perspective of the child, right? The children who aren't going to be able to articulate the impact that this has had on them. And honestly, 93% will never articulate anything because they're dead. Okay, this is not a child-friendly process. So first, let's talk about why surrogacy violates children's right to life. Surrogacy depends on IVF, in vitro fertilization, making children in petri dishes, okay? And this has been heralded as some kind of breakthrough for fertility. And that might be true, but it's not a breakthrough for children. Only 7% of lab-created babies will be born alive. Okay, only 7%. Once you're making babies outside of the marital embrace or the sexual embrace, 93% of those children are going to die. They either are going to spend the rest of their life languishing in a freezer, they will be thawed and discarded, they will be donated to research, they will not survive the thawing process, they will not survive the transfer to the mother's womb or the surrogate's womb, or they'll be selectively reduced, that is, aborted, because there's too many of them, or they're the wrong sex, or they're deemed non-viable. So surrogacy and the babies that it creates, I know that what you're seeing is women bringing precious children to the Capitol, saying this child would not have been possible without surrogacy. And that might be true. But the reality is that is one of the very few children that survive the process. This is not a child-friendly way to make children, even if a few of them do survive. So any questions about that in terms of IVF, the kind of perils that children who are not created in the sexual embrace have to experience, or thoughts on that, or objections that you think that you might hear from?
Why don't you mention the increased risk to the birth defects in the child as a result of the process?
Yeah.
Why don't you mention that?
Very good. So we do have on our website lists of ways that, so here's a problem. How do we know what outcomes there are on children who are created through these technologies, right? The best way is to survey the children themselves, especially as they've grown into adulthood, to say, what kind of medical conditions did you experience? What kind of diagnoses did you have? What kind of household instability did you experience? What kind of feelings, what kind of academic struggles did you have? The way that we do most family surveys these days, especially with these novel family arrangements, whether it's same-sex parenting or parents of surrogacy or even parents that use IVF, is we survey the parents. How do you think the child is doing? How do you think they're faring? And because we don't track children created through reproductive technologies, we don't have very much objective data on how they fare. So now it's going to be the fertility industry's word against the word of them before us. Because this is the first time that we have made babies without sex. You would think that the government would have an interest in figuring out how these children fare. That research is not taking place because the only people that really have the means to do so is the industry, which probably wouldn't like the results. But yes, we do have some limited studies on the fact that this does seem to have some health consequences, specifically some developmental impacts on children created this way. These are all high-risk pregnancies. The children are more likely to be born preterm or expire before they're able to be born at all. So we have got indications that this is bad for their physical health. But again, we don't know. And if these children grow up, some of them don't know that they were conceived through IVF or a sperm donor or an egg donor until they take a 23andMe test, when they're 35. So how do you survey a group of people when they don't know that they belong in the survey? So one thing that you might want to do if the fertility world brings another bill is say, well, let's require that you screen and vet and track every single prospective parent that comes through here so that we can monitor all these kids, right? Why don't we make these adults go through the adoption process, right? If adoptive parents like me, and probably many of you, if you went through the adoption process, you went through vetting, screening, background checks, home studies, references, training, supervision, post-placement, right? Social workers understand that it's risky if an adult wants to take an unrelated baby home from the hospital. But parents who are creating children through surrogacy, they don't go through those processes, right? They don't have to clear background checks. The only check that has to clear is the check at the bank. So why don't you propose, okay, if you guys want to take surrogate-born children home who may or may not have a genetic connection with their parent, why don't they all go through the same processes that South Dakota parents have to go through when they want to adopt a child? We'll do home studies on them, references, background checks, post-placement, supervision. And the answer is they'll say, no, because maybe 95% of their clients don't even live in South Dakota. And yet they're gonna take babies home and fly them across international borders anyway. So the next way that surrogacy violates children's rights, children have a natural right to their mother and father. They have a natural right to their mother and father. So we spend chapter 1 of our book talking about this natural right, pulling in some scholars, some natural law reasoning, and talking about the importance of this right on children's well-being. So this violates children's rights to their mother and father for 2 reasons. Number 1, it violates their right to their birth mother, okay? So anybody that's worked at a pregnancy resource center knows that one of the main ways that you counsel women in crisis pregnancies is to encourage them to love and bond with their baby, right? Because that maternal bond, it really matters, even in utero. We don't place babies on the chests of random strangers so they can forge a bond. We place them on their mother's chest because they have an existing bond, right? And to break that bond for children inflicts trauma. And again, I'm an adoptive mom, and I know that there are times where sometimes that bond may need to be broken especially for the sake of the child, not because the adult wants a kid, but sometimes it's in the best interest of the child to place them with adoptive parents, right? That's true. But sociologically, we don't pretend like it's cost-free. So we've included the story here of a woman who was created through surrogacy, who talks about the trauma that she experienced. And she was actually created through traditional surrogacy, where the birth mother and the surrogate was the same mother, which is what we used to call adoption, except that there's a contract signed ahead of birth, so now it's surrogacy, right? So why is it those contractual distinctions make obviously what used to be called adoption into something now really different? And that's another thing you're gonna notice about these proposed bills, is there's gonna be like an emphasis on the contract, the contract, the contract. The kid doesn't care about the contract. The kid's losing a connection with their birth mother. The kid's often losing a connection with their genetic mother or father. The kid doesn't care whether or not the contract was signed before conception or after conception. They're losing the same thing, either way. So there is quite a bit of studies done on maternal separation and the impact that it has on children. There's a book that was written by an adoption professional called The Primal Wound that talks about why that separation from the birth mother is more likely to lead to trust, bonding, attachment issues. And that looks to be true because adoptive parents are more educated, more wealthy, and statistically spend more time with their children than average parents do, right? So it's not like they're going to homes where they're not getting the right level of care. There does seem to be something about that maternal bond that impacts children's well-being later on. And that's not to say that adopted kids are doomed. They're not, right? My son going to rule the world someday. I mean, he's incredible and he's brilliant. But there's some loss there. It's harder for him to understand why he doesn't look like everybody else in the family. And while we share the best possible case for why his mother and father relinquished him, we don't know their identities. It's illegal to abandon your child in China, so parents are careful not to leave any identifying information. There's sadness there, even though we speak very hopefully and positively about it. So every place that you see underlined, there is a link to a study or a story or a testimony. And if you go to our website, I put the link, the address for this right here. So this exists on our website, and you can hyperlink to any of the stories or studies that we quote in here if you want additional information. Any other thoughts or questions on the connection, the maternal-child bond in utero, and why that might be detrimental to kids?
I don't know anything about the surrogacy business or the health of the children coming from surrogacy, but I did embryo transfers in the purebred business for 10 years.
Well, that's how this all began, right? You guys paved the way for us.
I can tell you that the weirdest things I ever saw on a heifer or a bull were from the embryo transfer calves. I mean, weird growths, weird spots, and a couple that came from one transfer, multiple eggs. These cattle got ringworm right up and down their face on half, and the other half was perfect. And the vet said, that is the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And we had to treat them for weeks to get rid of it. So you do alter the DNA and RNA in the nucleic center of that cell when you do the transfer. You give them all kinds of drugs to get them to flush eggs, and then you give them drugs to make them accept that egg. So there's some things that I don't think most people realize.
Yeah. Yeah, from egg donation, right, which requires high doses of injected hormones in a woman so that her body releases not one egg a month, but 10, 20, right? So there's that factor. Creating children in glass. We're not supposed to be created in glass. Exposing embryos to light that were usually conceived in dark places, right? Freezing them. Humans aren't made to be frozen. They're not made to be frozen. We are doing such radical experimental procedures on children And it's all because adults want something. And what those adults may want is noble, but it does not. No adult's desire should infringe on a child's right. It just shouldn't. And in my other life, I'm a pastor's wife. And so I do a lot of marriage counseling with my husband on people who long to be parents, single women who would be incredible mothers, who just haven't found Mr. Right, people who are dealing with infertility, people who experience same-sex attraction, who would be awesome fathers. And so those longings are real, and those people deserve our empathy and compassion. And none of it justifies violating children's rights, especially as policymakers, right? Your job is to enact justice. Let me, as the pastor's wife, offer compassion. You deal with the thing that I can't do, which is bring justice. Okay, so surrogacy routinely severs children's connection to their biological mother and father. So they're always going to lose their birth mother. They often also lose their genetic mother or their birth mother. Again, we don't know how often this happens because unlike things like organ donation, we don't have any kind of record-keeping system for this at all, right? This is a marketplace. So let's contrast this with adoption. Adoption is an institution centered around the needs of children. Big fertility is a marketplace centered around the desires of adults. There are two totally different things. And what you might hear is, well, surrogacy is just another form of adoption. When you look at adoption best practice, surrogacy is actually the opposite of adoption, right? When adoption is done right, every child that needs a family is going to be gifted with a loving home. But not every adult who wants a kid is going to get one, right? I worked at an adoption agency. Some people that applied were like, hell no. I mean, that was the only response. No way should you have a child placed with you. No way. There is no kind of screening criteria except how much is in your bank account when you're talking about children created through big fertility. So there are drawbacks to not being raised by your biological parents, and we highlight 3 of them. The first one is safety, right? That we don't have a lot of data on children created through reproductive technologies, but we have a lot of data on children who are raised outside of their biological married mother and father home. And let me first say, I know heroic step-parents who have filled the gap for a negligent biological parent, and they absolutely deserve our support and our praise. But as a children's rights activist, when I look at the studies, I see that anytime you step away from a child being raised by their biological parents, the child experiences diminished outcomes, especially in the area of safety. And if you want to fact check me, you can get your phone out right now and Google the words mother's boyfriend. Okay? Because it takes more than being in a romantic relationship with a child's parent to treat the child as a parent. And if you were to do that, you would see pages and pages and pages of the most horrific child abuse, neglect, and filicide, that would be child murder, ever. In fact, statistically, and I'm just talking about broad statistics, right? Statistically, the most dangerous place for a child is in the home where they are cared for by an unrelated man. He is the most dangerous person in a child's life. So,
Unrelated men are bad.
unrelated men in the home, especially ones that are caring for a child, are dangerous. And this is exactly why adoptive parents like me have to go through screening and vetting. Because adoption agencies and social workers are not fools. They understand it's risky to send a child home with unrelated adults, right? And that's why we have to rightly go through all of these screenings. It would be negligent for adoptive agencies not to make us go through this, right? And yet, the reproductive technology world does that routinely. They promote it, right? It's not a problem for them. This is something where you can make your dream child. You can create a designer baby. You can literally look up catalogs for eggs and catalogs for sperms. You can Google egg donor catalog, sperm donor catalog. And you can, you can decide, well, I'd really like a blonde kid. Or I'd really like a baby that has a father who has an Ivy League degree. I mean, you'll have to pay a little bit more, but you know, what's a couple $1,000 to get your dream child, right? And so these are two different things, right? Adoption is centered around the best interest of the children. Reproductive technologies are centered around the desires of adults. It's a marketplace. And often that means that children are put in homes that are riskier, more unstable, and less safe, okay? We can definitely talk about the incredible step-parents that we know, and I could go on and on about a couple in my life who have just been incredible that I know. But you can't debate the importance of biology when it comes to creating safety for kids. And that's the reason why adoption agencies have developed decades of best practice around screening prospective parents. So any questions? And of course, we've put a couple quotes from kids here about the disconnect that so children created through reproductive technologies have actually coined a new phrase, and it's called social parent, right? It's the parent that raised them, but it's the parent that they're not biologically related to, right? So maybe they were created through sperm donation, so they have a social father. Because even the kids will say, yeah, he's my father, but he's not my father, right? They needed a new term for the person that raised them. And he didn't adopt them, so it's not my adoptive father, but he's been here during my life, so he's my social father. But many of them would say, no, my father is actually the person who donated me, right? The one that the world tells me doesn't matter because biology doesn't matter, your parents are the ones who raised you, and yet, that's my father too. So they've coined this term, social parent, and many of them do not feel as connected to their social parent, and many of them report that their social parent did not feel as connected to them. So we've shared some quotes here. Any questions on that in terms of the connection and the importance of connection to your genetic and biological parents?
Can I make one observation?
You can actually do this presentation. I don't know who you are,
No,
but I
let
like
me-
everything that you say.
So, traditionally, society has always felt that to the fullest extent possible, a child should be raised by both natural parents. When that's not possible, that has always been viewed as a tragedy.
Yes.
So, it has always been viewed as a tragedy that a child can't be raised by his or her natural mother. The first out of many, many problems with surrogacy is that it is a plan in advance to defeat that policy, that before you do anything else, we're going to make it so that this child, before the child is even conceived, is never going to get to know his mother, who carries him. And one of the problems that people lose sight of is the role of pregnancy. Why is there pregnancy? Why does nature have pregnancy? Why did God create pregnancy? Why did Christ go through pregnancy? Okay? Biologically, what we now know and didn't know until 5 years ago is that during pregnancy, a mother's brain undergoes a permanent physiological change in the area of social adjustment that prepares her for a lifelong, the basis for a lifelong loving relationship with her child. That child bonds. When that child's born, the only human being in the world that child knows is that mother whose voice the child knows, heartbeat, scent, and love. All right? So we have started out, because we think we're smarter than nature and smarter than God, to deprive that child and that woman of that relationship. And when that woman realizes it's not in the child's best interest, we tell her that we don't care, and we don't care what's in child's best interest, because we're going to enforce a contract. Okay, I've said enough about it.
I'm Katy Faust. And who are you?
This is Harold Cassidy. I've told you about it.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, well, that's true. And so there are so many different ways to look at this issue in terms of looking at the harm. What Them Before Us does is we zero in on the child, right? There are problems with commodifying women in this process. That is one of the main reasons why surrogacy is widely banned across Europe, okay? There are definitely problems with siblings, right? In terms of siblings watching babies grow in their mother's womb and then those babies are given away, okay? I mean, when you disrupt the most biologically determined relationship that any of us have ever had in our life, and you do it intentionally, there's going to be fractured fallout all around. Them before us focus specifically on children's rights. So if you want more problems, you'll find them. But we feel like this is the most effective approach because it gives you guys somebody to fight for. You need to fight for kids. You're not fighting against infertile adults. You're not fighting against same-sex couples. You are fighting for kids. You are insisting that every adult, single, married, gay, and straight, conforms to these rights. Okay, you have the same expectation for all adults, regardless of how they sexually identify, regardless of their marital status, regardless of whether or not they are fertile. Everybody needs to conform to these rights. This is an issue of justice. So the next, if you flip it over, the next way that children struggle who are conceived through big fertility, specifically third-party reproduction, sperm donation, egg donation, or surrogacy, is issues of identity, right? Adopted children tend to understand what this means as well, that they struggle with, they were the first to be studied, and the term was coined genealogical bewilderment. This idea of who am I, like I can't place myself in a mirror, right? Interestingly, the only study that we have that compares outcomes of adopted kids and reproductive technology kids shows that adoptees fare better than kids created through reproductive technologies, right? Even though the sperm donor kids were at least connected biologically to one parent and the adopted kids by neither parent. And yet, the adopted kids did better than the ones created through big fertility. So I would posit that that's because in adoption, adults are doing the hard thing for kids, right? We are the ones that are saying, we understand that you have a need. We're gonna go through the process. We're gonna do the hard thing. We're gonna do the background checks and screenings. We're gonna fly to China or fly to Ukraine or wherever it is, because we understand that you need to be rescued. And we're not the one responsible for breaking their bond with their parent. We're trying to mend what was broken. In big fertility, you also have a broken bond, but the children are being raised by the adults who inflicted the wound. The children are being raised by the adults who decided that the other parent should be gone. So in the adoptive home, right, like our home, if my son wants to talk about how conflicted he feels that he was left in a box in the city square, I will start crying with him. You know, I'll say, I seriously, honey, I'm so sorry. Does that make you sad? Because that makes me sad. And he'll say, it makes me sad. And we can mourn over that together, because I didn't choose to put him in that box. Children created through sperm and egg donation often struggle with identity issues. They often struggle with trusting their parents. And that more so than adoptees, probably because they're living with the adult responsible for their loss and feel like they can't talk to them about it, right? If they were to say, I'm sad, I would like to know who my biological father is, they're talking to the person who didn't want that biological father in their home or in their life. So the answer is, honey, he's not your dad, right? You don't need a dad. Or the man in your home is your dad. Or, honey, that doesn't matter. You are so lucky that you were so loved and wanted, right? Which means shut up and get on board with what I want. I mean, that's really how a lot of the kids feel. There's actually surveys to show like how anxious and nervous these kids feel about talking with their intended parents. So identity is an issue, right? Again, it's not necessarily something that a lot of people in our generation think about, because most of us grew up knowing who our mother and father were. Kids created through reproductive technologies struggle with identity issues, and perhaps also that is correlative to the fact that they have more substance abuse issues as well, right? They just tend to struggle more. So sometimes kids can't be raised by their biological parents, and then a just society does what they can, but intentionally to inflict that loss on kids, that's an injustice. Yeah.
Thank you, this is fascinating.
Hey, you made it. How was the committee?
I think, those of us as legislators who've seen surrogacy bills come up over the last few years, we're kind of used to this discussion being one in which a abortion is a component of the broader discussion. But you know, the more I think about this, how can this not be what I believe it is? And that is, this surrogacy subject is really the Armageddon battleground about abortion. Because if we can successfully legislate, or whatever we have to do, if we can successfully get it into people's minds that this is about identity, the implications of a freshly fertilized egg having its own unique identity as a person, it ruins the whole abortion discussion. And so I see this as not a subsection of abortion discussion. I see this as the ultimate battleground for abortion.
Okay, so, and you're exactly right, and I would say this is the flip side, right? This is the same issue from the other perspective. So abortion says, if I don't want a child, I can violate their right to life and force them out of existence. Surrogacy says, if I really want a child, I can violate their right to life, or some kids' right to life, and or their right to their mother and father, and force them into existence. Right? In both of those cases, the child is a commodity, and their rights are determined by what the adults want. The reality is, in both situations, the children are vulnerable people who are distinct individuals who, from the moment of conception, have rights that need to be protected, regardless of what adults want. Right? This is two sides of the same child commodification coin. Right? Unwanted, kill them. Wanted, violate however many children's rights to life we need to, and custom make our perfect baby, separate them from their mother or father and or birth mother. It doesn't matter what they have, pay $100,000, doesn't matter what they have a right to, this is what I want, right? So the abortion mentality, I really do believe, has made surrogacy possible, right? It's the same thing.
Well, and again, you know, if we are successful in establishing that a freshly fertilized embryo is a person,
Yeah.
for the purposes of this discussion of surrogacy, then why would that not have an implication that goes far beyond the discussion of surrogacy, and just, if that's true for surrogacy, it's gotta be true in every other instance as well.
Thank you, exactly, Dale.
So the abortion industry, the surrogacy industry, may well be coming to the legislature asking for a regulation of this industry in the state of South Dakota. It sounds very nice on the surface, but what's your response to that?
I'd say, great, ensure that these children's rights are protected. Ensure that no child loses their right to life. Every child goes home with their biological mother and father. And no child is paid for, and it'll destroy their business.
May I make an observation about
Yeah.
that? There's absolutely no reason and no justification for an enabling statute, regardless of the regulation. There's just no justification for it. And two things you touched on that I'd just like to, I don't want to take your time. Is it right if I just mention two things?
You
How
can't
fast?
hear him?
Oh, it's,
Okay.
you're too quiet.
Okay. So what the speaker touched on.
You wanna stand up and turn? And
No,
start?
no, I'm
Okay.
all right. I'm
Okay,
thinking.
you're gonna have to yell.
They can. Two things that were touched on. The exploitation of women, all right? So the European Union has declared it a human rights violation for that reason, okay? So when it was the feminists who kept surrogacy criminal in New York for decades, Gloria Steinem,
Yep.
Betty Friedan. Now, Betty Friedan devoted her life to try to get women to be able to compete in the commercial and professional lives of the country, yet she and Gloria Steinem supported, right to the end, the Mary Beth Whiteheads who never finished high school. They had to choose between the Dr. Stern and the Mary Beth Whitehead, and they chose Mary Beth Whitehead and stood up and filed theirs in support of them right to the very end, because it was such an exploitation of women and they saw it as such, okay? The other point you touch on, this is without question, we have always said selling children is illegal, it's criminal. This is worse than the sale of children. This is the manufacture of a child for the sole purpose of selling the child to the highest bidder.
That's right.
I won't interfere with you anymore.
So, no, you just have totally set us up. Because the next item is violating children's rights to be born free. And we talk about this case of Teresa Erickson, who was a darling of the fertility industry. She was a trailblazer, a book writer, right? And she was indicted for baby selling. So let's talk about why she went to jail. So she realized that, obviously there's a bit of a hang up when you're, trying to select sperm, egg donor, create the embryos, and then figure out where the surrogate goes. But you know what? There's actually a whole awful lot of surplus embryos that are already out there, already made, So she would take those embryos and she would implant them in surrogates. She would do it in the Ukraine because Ukraine, they would love to make South Dakota like Ukraine, where there's hardly any restrictions, where you can do anything you want, right? It's a lot cheaper, there's no regulations, right? So she took these surrogates to Ukraine, implanted them with embryos, and then when the babies were in their second trimester, she'd say, oh, we have this surrogate pregnancy, and the intended parents backed out. Is there anybody that might be able to take these children? And of course, there were tons of people who were like, wait a second, I can have a baby, a guaranteed baby, that's already in the second trimester. In 5 months, yeah, I'll do that. And they would pay her $100,000 to $150,000, and they'd take the baby home. She was indicted for baby selling. Now, her crime is not that those babies went home with unrelated adults. That is a routine occurrence in reproductive technologies. Her crime is she signed the contract 6 months too late. If she had signed the contract before the child was implanted, it would have been helping someone build a family. But because she signed it 6 months later or 3 months later, it was baby selling. So riddle me this. Like, why is it that the timing of when paperwork is signed determines whether or not something is selling children? Because the cost is the same to the kid either way, right? So that tells you that it is the contract alone, right, that delineates whether or not this is child trafficking or helping someone build a family. And yet for the kid, there's no difference. So many children, about half, created through big fertility, talk about how they are troubled that money changed hands over their conception. They feel like they were commodified. They feel like they were shopped for because they were shopped for. And so we share a few of their testimonies here at the bottom. We have dozens on our website. We've got, in the 7th chapter of our book, we have about 30 stories of children created through sperm and egg donation. We've got another 15 stories in our chapter on surrogacy of children who lost a relationship with their mother or who were raised in completely motherless homes due to surrogacy or surrogacy style arrangements. So that's what I want. I want you to know these children and understand how they have suffered because of these processes and fight for them. So that's kind of the end. But I want to know what your questions are. I want to know what you're worried about when it comes to somebody bringing some legislation. What kind of answers can I give you that you feel you might need in the upcoming battle? Yeah.
This is really probably kind of a basic one, but when we had this last time in the Capitol, where we had the proponents really in our faces, they would say, you were able to have kids. You have no idea what it's like to want a baby. You never had that problem. And of course I'm pretty sympathetic to that.
Absolutely.
Feeling guilty because
Yeah.
I could carry my own children. I oftentimes would like to give a couple of them away. but how would you answer them?
Yeah, I think you empathize with their suffering, and you say, "I'm so sorry." But
But then they've seen I'm sympathetic and
yeah,
it gets worse.
right? So the only way to solve their problem is for a kid to lose something, and that's unacceptable to me. So it's fascinating to me that many of these people say, "Well, I want to have a surrogate child because I really want a biological connection with my kid. Otherwise, you could adopt." They don't want to adopt because biology seems to matter to them, doesn't it? And yet, this whole industry is based on disregarding children's need for a biological connection. It's really important if the parents want it. It's completely unimportant if the kids want it. So they have to figure out a way to solve the problem without inflicting loss on children, right? And obviously, I think the best way to do that is adoption, where they are mending the wound. But any iteration of surrogacy will inflict a wound, whether it's mother loss, whether it's the loss of genetic connection, whether it's the loss of being able to say I was born free without the influence of money. Solve your very understandable problem without making a kid pay for it. That's my response. And that's probably not satisfying. I know those women. I know those women who go through what feels like a devastating heartbreak one time every month, and it devastates them. I know that freight train of emotion that I don't know it personally, but I have walked with it with many women. No amount of adult emotion justifies severing a child's right. It doesn't. And we all do this in the pro-life world all the time. Women are scared. They have a difficult diagnosis. They feel abandoned. And they have this freight train of emotion. We empathize with them. No amount of adult emotion justifies severing a child's right to life. The same thing applies in reproductive technologies. Just because two men desperately want to be fathers, no amount of that desire to be a father justifies severing a child's right to their mother. Just because an infertile couple desperately wants to have biological children, that does not justify severing a child's relationship with their birth mother, or having 11 of their embryos languish in a freezer for 20 years because the first 2 implantations were successful. I'm sorry. Sometimes the answer to what adults want is no, if it means that they're going to make a kid pay the price.
I'm gonna give them your business card. Say it a lot better.
Well,
But, you know, I thought the last time this came up, the contract was the problem. You know, I was all focused on the contract is wrong. But I think I had these words come out of my own mouth that, you know, if it was my sister, you know, isn't it okay to like be a surrogate for your sister? But from what I'm hearing from you, there's problems even with that.
yeah.
I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, well, but that's actually really helpful, because that will be the case. They will find the situation where it's a lovely heterosexual Christian couple that can't have children, and her sister is going to do it for free. What's the harm, right? To that I say, the government may not necessarily want to regulate that. Or may not, like, fine, figure it out. But don't you bring this to the place where it's like industry level regulation, because your teeny little thing is the exception, and it will throw the doors wide open to on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide. So there is a labor and delivery nurse in California that feeds me underground information. She's got a whole cohort of nurses, and California, they would like South Dakota to be like California, because your women are cheaper, honestly, than California women. And more of them are on TRICARE, right? So then that lowers the costs, right? So it would be really nice if your women could rent their bodies instead of California women. But she says that in their labor and delivery unit, they have on average about 1 surrogate pregnancy a week, right? Anywhere from 3 to 5 a month. In the last 5 years, she said, we've noted 1 Californian couple coming to take their child home. 1 in 5 years. Most of them are foreign. Most of them are overseas. Many of them are single or double dads, right? So they will bring a very sympathetic picture to your legislature. They will not bring the single father from Japan who's created 20 different children through different surrogates across Cambodia and India and who would like to do it in South Dakota if he could. Okay? That is not the scenario that you're going to see here. So you just have to stand firmly, even in the very sympathetic, you have to do this without violating children's rights. Adults should not make children sacrifice for them. That's actually the definition of an adult, is the one who has the capacity to sacrifice, understand, and accommodate. Don't make kids do it. Yeah,
Just because I want to know, a personal question.
yeah.
What was the spark plug that opened wide your pupils that developed the passion that you have? Because you're really good at what you do.
We should be friends for a long time. I'm really nice. I'm normally really, really nice.
I can
But
tell.
my husband and I did youth ministry for a long time. And I watched kids get devastated by their mom or dad being gone. And then when I heard the other side, first in the marriage debate, but now in every single other issue, of kids don't care. They're fine. They love having two moms or two dads, right? They're gonna be happy if the adults are happy, or whatever it is. You know, the little bit of me that's a pastor's wife that carries my Bible around everywhere with me, which I do, kind of steps aside and I'm like, when you want to make kids sacrifice for you, right? It's unjustifiable. When you mess with someone's childhood, you mess with their whole life. I mean, now, like all of the ministry that we do, the counseling that we do, so much of it ties back to kids didn't get what they deserved as kids. And now they're parents on their own, trying to figure it out and work through all of these traumas or missing parent or dysfunction or whatever it is. And very often that dysfunction is connected to mom or dad not doing what they should have done for that kid. And now we are normalizing it, promoting, incentivizing it in the name of progress through these technologies. And it's an injustice. Sometimes tragedy happens, right? And a just society cares for those orphans. We don't manufacture orphans. And that's what's going on in big fertility right now, is the manufacturing of orphans for profit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That explains it.
I think sometimes here in South Dakota, I've seen this in a lot of places, we sit here and we think, well, this just doesn't happen here. How many things did we see? But I've had a lot of conversations with our register of deeds, and she is seeing more and more people coming across her desk that are exchanging these commodity babies and going overseas.
Yes. Wouldn't it
It's
be
just
nice if
free
somebody
money.
was tracking them? Like, we don't even treat livers this casually. But babies? Yeah, it would be amazing. I'd love to talk to your friend. I would love to have some data, but they don't want us to have it. They want us to have the little case of the woman who's saying, can my sister do this for me? That's all they want you to see. Yeah, thank you. What's your name? Rhonda?
Rhonda.
Good, thank you. Any other? I know you guys, your time's so precious.
I just more
Yeah.
of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
I got your book and I'm working through it. But, just thank you so much for forming the argument this way, because even when I think about things like divorce, you know, if we go back to that, that's kind of when it started being about, you know, what do the parents want versus what's best for the children. And so just having a way to even formulate that and make that argument. I even think about in my own life, like what's best for the child versus me, them before us. And
Yep.
so just thank you.
Well, honestly, it's something that we should have done all through the pandemic. You know, how can we put children before adults instead of using them as shields? They're children because children cannot lobby, they don't write newsletters, they can't donate to your campaign, right? That we always put us before them. So that's the goal of hopefully fortifying you, is that you would be one of the few who is willing to put them before us and say, no, we're gonna stand on children's rights even if adults get upset. And you will piss everybody off. I just like a heads up, you're gonna piss everybody off, but kids are worth it.